Let's keep with the mental health theme, which I think we've got working throughout these three stories. Our third story is a new report has looked at Gen Z and millennial generations who are borrowing money or feeling they're forced to borrow money to pay for private mental health consultancy and services. So you shared this story with me earlier. What do you make of it?
So this is research from Spare Room, which is, I suppose, Renting's answer to Rightmove if you're not familiar with it. This is exactly that. And this is that young people seemingly cannot access mental health via the NHS. And I know that that is the case for many, many people because I have friends that have tried to access mental health services via the NHS before, and they have had to go private because the waiting list is so long that they're worried about themselves and they need to solve the problem. But so this is 15% of 18 to 24-year-olds and nearly 1 in 10, 25 to 40-year-olds who were forced to borrow money during the pandemic, did so to pay for private mental health care, which is a really sad state of affairs, actually, isn't it? Because you have a double whammy there of, well, this horrific thing is causing your mental health to be particularly bad and
Yeah.
suffering. And then on top of that, you can't get help because we still don't consider mental health to be as detrimental as, or poor mental health, I should say, as, say, breaking your leg or breaking your arm, which of course you would go and get fixed and you would never think anything of it.
Yeah.
But when it comes to mental health, I think there is still too little help out there. And this is clearly what this research is showing. I mean, it was also as well, there's other wider stuff in this research that's just kind of about how particularly Gen Z and millennials have been forced to borrow money. And this is for all the reasons that we've talked about before, things like furlough, things like cuts to hours, things like literally their business or the business that they work for going out of business. And as a result, and it's to pay for things like bills, food and rent. It's not
Yeah.
like they're borrowing money to have fun, if
No, no,
one can have
it's for
fun.
quite serious reasons, and we know there's this very strong correlation between poor mental health and debt problems. The two do tend to go hand in hand. There's some fantastic work done by a charity, the Money and Mental Health Policy Institute, which was set up and sponsored by Martin Lewis, a money saving expert, and they do some wonderful research and work on this. But people who have poor mental health are also typically people who get into financial difficulties and take on excess debt, and we know that having problem debt can contribute to mental health problems.
Yeah, it's a
So
vicious
it
cycle.
feels like a vicious cycle, doesn't it? When you read this sort of research, for 2/3 of this group, it was the first time they've had to borrow money to pay for something. I'm a big believer that actually you should never worry about spending money on personal development type stuff, so improving yourself, or on your physical on mental well-being. I think those are two areas where spending should almost be completely unrestricted. They're so important. But if you feel you have to borrow and get into debt to access services that absolutely should be provided by the NHS and free at the point of use, I think there's something very, very wrong here. Particularly going back to our earlier story, we're seeing an increase in one of the habits, one of the trends from this pandemic is an increase of people with mental health problems for all the obvious reasons, being separated from friends and family and bereavement and all the things we've gone through, worries about your job, worries about the economic situation. So, yeah, it was quite a shocking one there. I'm not sure if you had any
Mm.
thoughts about what could be improved and what could be done differently to prevent people from getting into that position in the first place.
I mean, it's kind of the impossible question because, I mean, the issue that's caused this is something that nobody can control. I mean, I could go on and on about how we could have dealt with this pandemic better, but I won't bore you all. And obviously, just more funding for mental health support services in the UK, so that at least the help is there. Or maybe I mean, you can't regulate a private sector of mental health, but I guess more funding
Mm,
is the best way to do this because I think there are plenty of charities that are doing as much as they possibly
yeah.
can. But when you consider that an enormous amount of people have depression and anxiety and all
Mm,
sorts, and I actually am surprised all the time when I see how many people, because it affects I think it's so I have written the stats down. I'm trying not to look at my notes because it kind of throws me off. But oh, here we go. So signs of depression increased from 37% pre-pandemic to 48% during the pandemic. That means that almost 1 in 2 of us is walking around with signs of depression.
Yeah.
And so I don't think this is really an issue that we can ignore, even though I'm sure we are going to. The only, I suppose, saving grace when it comes to this particular piece of research that's been done and looking at the people that have been surveyed as a result, most of them are borrowing from either their parents or their friends.
Yeah.
So the good news here is that they are not necessarily racking up bad credit, or they're not going to, loan sharks or things like that. So at least in theory, that is money that is interest free, that's very, very easy to pay back. Although there was an example, somebody got into £30,000 worth of debt this pandemic, which is, I mean, you have no idea what that situation is. I don't know what the hell they needed 30 grand for. It might have been a perfectly good reason. But this is a huge problem, and it's not going to get solved, really, is it, until we have an economy that's functioning much better than it is currently.
Yeah.
The good news is we seem to be heading in that direction. But I don't know. What do you think? What would you do if you were Prime Minister for a day and were charged with dealing with the mental health?
Where I would start, but no, it requires proper funding. If the NHS doesn't have the right capacity for that, then funding needs to be available to make private services available to people who need it. And as you say, it's almost 1 in 2 of us now that have these signs of depression and mental health issues to deal with. It is a national issue, and it's going to have a big knock-on effect on all sorts of things, relationships and broader health issues and well-being in the economy. So I don't think it's something that can be sort of swept under the rug and ignored. I think this has to be addressed, and hopefully, and you mentioned earlier in our earlier segment about how the world of financial planning is becoming much more about happiness and well-being. Hopefully the world of politics will become much more about well-being, because historically the focus on the success of a nation has always been that GDP figure, the gross domestic product, and I think that's a pretty lousy way of measuring economic success.
Oh God, no, same. Yes, I completely agree. Why are we looking at GDP? Who cares about GDP?
Yeah.
I mean, care about GDP a little bit, but it shouldn't be. Everyday people, it doesn't matter. You don't really feel
there's more relevant measures of success, prosperity, happiness, well-being that I think we could go for, and let's all of us push our politicians and our representatives towards a world where that's the case.
Yes, 100%, 100%.
Let's finish there when we agree on something. That's always good. So, Hannah, thank you for joining us for this episode of Talking Money. As always, you can find show notes at icradio.co.uk. If you're watching on the YouTube channel, please do press like and subscribe and leave us a comment. Let us know what you think about each of the stories we've talked about. But thank you very much for listening and watching. And Hannah, thank you for joining us again.
Thank you very much.